Friends, I'm back with the end, I hope, of Holes. I wanted to finish it before spring break, and I meant to do it earlier today, and I got busy with answering some great emails from my fourth grade friends, and I ran out of time. It's kind of long. I thought I could finish it. Now I'm not so sure, but maybe I'll just read long. Anyway, so at the end of the story last time, Zero is basically passed out. He's dehydrated, he's sick, and he's passed out. And Stanley was carrying him, and he finally found these onions, and he gave Zero part of an onion and told him it was a hot fudge sundae, and that's where we left off. Stanley awoke in a meadow, looking up at a giant rock tower. It was layered and streaked with different shades of red, burnt orange, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay a while just looking at it. He didn't have the strength to get up. It felt like the insides of his mouth and throat were coated with sand, and no wonder. When he rolled over, he saw the water hole. It was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide, and at the bottom lay no more than 2 inches of very brown water. His hands and fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped some dirty water into his mouth and swished it around, trying to filter with his teeth. Zero moaned. I don't think the picture's very good today because I don't have a light on and my cat is on my lap so I can't get up, but I figure you're not really here to see me anyway. You just want to hear the story, so it doesn't really matter. Stanley started to say something to him, but no words came out of his mouth. He had to try again. "How you doing?" It hurt to talk. "Not good," Zero said. With great effort, he rolled over, raised himself to his knees, and crawled to the water hole. He lowered his head into it and lapped up some water. Then he jerked back, clutched his knees to his chest, and rolled to his side. His body shook violently. Maybe this is why you shouldn't eat 100-year-old peaches. Stanley thought about going down to the mountain to look for the shovel so he could make the water hole deeper. Maybe that would have given him cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But he just didn't have the strength to go down, let alone make it back up again. He didn't know where to look. Anyway, he struggled to his feet, and he was in a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way from the big thumb. He took a deep breath and then walked the last 50 yards to the giant precipice and touched it. "Tag, you're it." Then he walked back to Zero and the water hole. On the way, he picked one of the flowers. It actually wasn't one big flower, he discovered, but instead each flower was really a cluster of tiny little flowers that formed a little round ball. He brought it to his mouth, but had to spit it out. He could see part of the trail had been made they'd made the night before when he had carried Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down and look for the shovel, he realized he should do it soon while the trail was fresh. But he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid Zero might die while he was gone. Zero was still lying doubled over on his side. "I gotta tell you something," he said with a groan. "Don't talk," said Stanley. "Save your strength." "No, listen," Zero insisted, and then he closed his eyes as his face twisted with pain. "Okay, I'm listening," Stanley said. "I took your shoes," Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were on his feet. "That's all right," he said. "Just rest now." "It's all my fault," said Zero. "It's nobody's fault," said Stanley. "I didn't know," Zero said. "That's okay," Stanley said. "Just rest." Zero closed his eyes, but then again he said, "I didn't know about the shoes." "What shoes?" "From the shelter." It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. "Clyde Livingstone's shoes?" "I'm sorry," said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Remember, the reason Stanley is at the camp in the first place is because someone accused him of stealing some shoes, and what really happened is somebody else stole them and threw him off the overpass, and Stanley happened to catch him. So now it turns out Zero is the one who stole him. Zero's confession seemed to bring him some relief. The muscles in his face relaxed. As he drifted into sleep, Stanley softly sang him the song that had been in his family for generations. If only, the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer. While the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, he cries to the moon, if only, if only. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it had come to be there. He ate it gratefully, but now as he sat gazing at Big Thumb in the meadow full of flowers, he couldn't help but wonder about it. If there was one wild onion, there could be more. He intertwined his fingers and tried to rub out the pain. Then he bent down and dug up another flower, this time pulling out the entire plant, including the root. "Onions! Fresh, hot, sweet onions!" Sam called as Mary Lou pulled the cart down Main Street. 8 cents a dozen. It was a beautiful spring morning, and the sky was painted pale blue and pink, the same color as the lake and the peach trees along its shore. Sounds like Green Lake used to be really beautiful. Mrs. Gladys Tennyson was wearing just her nightgown and robe as she came running down the street after Sam. Mrs. Tennyson was normally a very proper woman who never went out in public without dressing up in fine clothes and a hat. So it was quite surprising to the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. "Sam!" she shouted. "Whoa, Mary Lou," said Sam, stopping the mule in his cart. "Good morning, Mrs. Tennyson," he said. "How's little Becca doing?" Gladys Tennyson was all smiles. "I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke an hour ago, thanks to you." "I'm sure the good Lord and Doc Hawthorne deserve most of the credit." "The good Lord, yes," agreed Mrs. Tennyson, "but not Dr. Hawthorne. That quack wanted to put leeches on her stomach." "Leeches, my word!" In case you don't know what a leech is, it's this little, it's not a bug. I don't even know what it really is. It's just this, it looks almost like a worm, but it's a little fatter, and it's got this sucker mouth, and if it sucks to your skin, it can try to drink your blood. It's kind of creepy, and they used to use them. They thought that if they put leeches on you, they got out the bad blood, then your body would make new blood, and you would be healed. "Leeches, my word! He said they would suck out the bad blood. Now you tell me, how would a leech know good blood from bad blood?" "I wouldn't know," said Sam. "It was your onion tonic," said Mrs. Tennyson. "That's what saved her." Other townspeople made their way to the cart. "Good morning, Gladys," said Hattie Parker. "Don't you look lovely this morning?" Several people snickered. "Good morning, Hattie," Mrs. Tennyson replied. "Does your husband know you're parading around in your bedclothes?" Hattie asked. There were more snickers. "My husband knows exactly where I am and how I'm dressed, thank you," said Mrs. Tennyson. "We have both been up all night and half the morning with Rebecca. She almost died from stomach sickness. It seems she ate some bad meat." Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher. "It made my husband and me sick as well," said Mrs. Tennyson, "but it nearly killed Becca. What with her being so young, Sam saved her life." "Oh, it wasn't me," said Sam. "It was the onions." "I'm glad Becca's all right," Hattie said contritely. "I keep telling Jim he needs to wash his knives," said Mrs. Pike, who owned the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself, then turned and quickly walked away. "Tell Becca that when she feels up to it, come by the store for a piece of candy," said Mr. Pike. "Thank you, I'll do that." Before returning home, Mrs. Tennyson bought a dozen onions from Sam. She gave him a dime and told him to keep the change. "I don't take charity," Sam told her, "but if you want to buy a few extra onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she'd appreciate it." "All right, then," said Mrs. Tennyson. "Give me my change in onions." Sam gave Mrs. Tennyson an additional 3 onions, and she fed them one at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Stanley and Zero slept on and off for the next 2 days, ate onions, all they wanted, and splashed dirty water into their mouths. In the late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade, and Stanley tried to make the hole deeper, but he really needed the shovel. His efforts seemed to stir up the mud and make the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak, but the sleep and the onions seemed to be doing him some good. Stanley was no longer afraid that he would die soon. Still, he didn't want to go for the shovel while Zero was asleep. He didn't want him to wake up and think he'd been deserted. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. "I think I'll go look for the shovel," Stanley said. "I'll wait here," Zero said feebly, as if he had any other choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and the onions had done him a lot of good as well. He felt a lot stronger. It was fairly easy to follow the trail he'd made 2 days earlier. There were a few places where he wasn't sure he was going the right way, but it took just a little bit of searching when he found to find the trail again. He went quite a ways down the mountain, but still didn't find the shovel. He looked back up toward the top of the mountain. He must have walked right past it, he thought. There's no way he could have carried Zero all the way from here. Still, he headed downward just in case. He came to a bare spot between 2 large patches of weeds and sat down to think. Now he had definitely gone too far, he decided. He was tired out from all the walking down the hill. It would have been impossible to have carried Zero up the hill from here, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must be buried in some weeds. Before starting back up, he took one last look around in all directions. He saw a large indentation in the weeds a little further down the mountain. It didn't seem likely that the shovel could be there, but he'd already come this far. There, lying in some weeds, he found the shovel and a sack of jars. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and the sack might have rolled down the hill. But none of the jars were broken except the ones which had broken earlier. And if they had rolled down the hill, he doubted he would have found the sack and the shovel side by side. On his way back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit down and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb. Zero's condition continued to improve. Stanley slowly peeled an onion, and he liked eating them one layer at a time. The water hole was now almost as large as the holes he had dug back at Camp Green Lake. It contained almost 2 feet of murky water. Stanley had dug it all himself. Zero had offered to help, but Stanley thought it better for Zero to save his strength. It was a lot harder to dig in water than it was at a dry lake. Stanley was surprised that he himself hadn't gotten sick, either from the sploosh, the dirty water, or from living on onions. He used to get sick quite a lot back home. Both boys were barefoot. They had washed their socks. All their clothes were very dirty, but their socks were definitely the worst. They didn't dip their socks into holes, afraid to contaminate the water. Instead, they filled the jars, poured water over their dirty socks. I didn't go to the homeless shelter very often, Zero said. Just if the weather was really bad, I'd have to find someone to pretend to be my mom. If I'd gone by myself, they would have asked me a bunch of questions. If they'd found out that I didn't have a mom, they would have made me a ward of the state. What's a ward of the state? So Zero didn't have any family at all? That is really sad. I thought maybe they were just saying that earlier. Zero smiled. I don't know, but I didn't like the sound of it. Stanley remembered Mr. Pendanski telling the warden that Zero was a ward of the state. He wondered if Zero knew he'd become one. I like sleeping outside, said Zero. I used to pretend I was a Cub Scout. I always wanted to be a Cub Scout. I'd see them at the park in their blue uniforms. I was never a Cub Scout, said Stanley. I wasn't good at social stuff like that. Kids made fun of me because I was fat. I like the blue uniform, said Zero. Maybe I wouldn't like being a Cub Scout, though. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. My mother once was a Girl Scout, said Zero. I thought you said you didn't have a mother. Everybody has a mother. Well, yeah, I know that. She said she won the prize for selling the most Girl Scout cookies, said Zero. She was real proud of that. Stanley peeled off another layer of the onion. We always took what we needed, Zero said, when I was little. I didn't even know it was stealing. I don't remember it when I found out, but we just took what we needed, never more. So when I saw the shoes on display in the shelter, I just reached in the glass case and took them. Clyde Livingstone's shoes? Asked Stanley. I didn't know they were his. I just thought they were somebody's old shoes. It was better to take someone's old shoes, I thought, than steal a pair of brand new ones. I didn't know they were famous. There was a sign, but of course I couldn't read it. Then the next thing I know, everybody's making this big deal about how the shoes are missing. It was kind of funny in a way. The whole place is going crazy. There I was, wearing the shoes, and everybody's running around saying, "What happened to the shoes? The shoes are gone. What happened to the shoes? I just walked out the door." So no one noticed me, so I just left. When I got outside, I ran around the corner and immediately took off the shoes, and I put them on a parked car. I remember they smelled really bad. Yep, those were them, said Stanley. Did they fit you? Oh, pretty much. Stanley remembered being surprised at Clyde Livingstone's small shoe size. Stanley's shoes were bigger. Clyde Livingstone had small, quick feet. Stanley's feet were big and slow. I should have just kept them, said Zero. I'd already made it up. Sorry about that. Hey, you guys. Sorry. I'd already made it out of the... Sorry, I lost my place now. Oh, here we are. I should have just kept them, said Zero. I'd already made it out of the shelter and everything. I ended up getting arrested the next day when I tried to walk out of a shoe store with a brand new pair of sneakers. If I just kept those old smelly sneakers, then neither of us would be here right now. So one of them got arrested for stealing new sneakers, and one of them got arrested for stealing old sneakers that he didn't even steal. Zero became strong enough to help dig the hole, and when he finished, it was over 6 feet deep. He filled the bottom with rocks to help separate the water from the dirt. He was still the best hole digger around. That's the last hole I'll ever dig, he declared, throwing down the shovel. Stanley smiled. He wished it were true, but he knew they'd have no choice but to eventually return to Camp Green Lake. They couldn't live on onions forever. They had been completely around Big Thumb. It was like a giant sundial. They followed the shade. They were able to see out in all directions, and there was no place to go. The mountain was surrounded by desert. Zero stared at Big Thumb. It must have a hole in it, he said, filled with water. You think? Where else would the water be coming from? Zero said. Water doesn't run uphill. Stanley bit into an onion. It didn't burn his eyes or nose, and in fact, he no longer noticed a particularly strong smell. He remembered when he had first carried Zero up the hill, how the air had smelled bitter. It was the smell of thousands of onions growing and rotting and sprouting. Now he didn't smell a thing. How many onions do you think we've eaten? He asked. Zero shrugged. I don't even know how long we've been here. Well, I'd say about a week, said Stanley, and we probably each eat about 20 onions a day, so that's 280 onions, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I bet we really stink. That's a lot of onions. I like onions, but I don't think I want to eat that many, 20 a day. 2 nights later, Stanley lay awake, staring up at the star-filled sky. He was too happy to fall asleep. He knew he had no reason to be happy. He'd heard or read somewhere that right before a person freezes to death, he suddenly feels nice and warm. He wondered if perhaps he was experiencing something like that. It occurred to him that he couldn't remember the last time he felt happiness. It wasn't just being sent to Camp Green Lake that made his life miserable. Before that, he'd been unhappy at school. He'd had no friends, and bullies like Derek Dunn picked on him. And no one liked him, and the truth was, he didn't really like himself either. But he liked himself now. He wondered if he was delirious. He looked over at Zero sleeping near him. Zero's face was lit in the starlight, and there was a flower petal in front of his nose that moved back and forth as he breathed. It reminded Stanley of something out of a cartoon. Zero breathed in, and the petal was drawn up almost touching his nose. Zero breathed out, and the petal moved toward his chin. It stayed on Zero's face for an amazingly long time before fluttering off to the side. Stanley considered placing it back in front of Zero's nose, but it wouldn't be the same. It seemed like Zero had lived at Camp Green Lake forever, but as Stanley thought about it now, he realized that Zero must have gotten there no more than a month or 2 before him. Zero was actually arrested a day later, but Stanley's trial kept getting delayed because of baseball. He remembered what Zero had said a few days before. If Zero had kept on those shoes, then neither of them would be there right now. As Stanley stared at the glittering night sky, he thought there was no place he'd rather be. He was glad Zero put the shoes on the parked car. Well, I said that they threw him over the overpass. I thought that's what happened, but I guess not. He'd left him on top of a car. He was glad they fell. Oh, yeah, so they did fall. Okay, that's what I thought. He was glad they fell from the overpass and hit him in the head. When the shoes first fell from the sky, he remembered thinking that destiny had struck him. Now he thought so again. It was more than a coincidence. It had to be destiny. Maybe they wouldn't have to return to Camp Green Lake, he thought. Maybe they could make it past the camp, then follow the dirt road back to civilization. They could fill the sack with onions and 3 jars with water. And he had his canteen as well. They could fill their jars and canteen at the camp, maybe sneak into the kitchen and get some food. He doubted any counselors were still on guard. Everyone had to think they were dead by now. Buzzard food. It would mean living the rest of his life as a fugitive. The police would always be after him. At least he could call his parents and tell them he was alive. But he couldn't go visit them in case the police were watching the apartment. Don't you think they had better things to do than a kid who took some tennis shoes? Although if everyone thought he was dead, they wouldn't even bother to watch the apartment. He would have to somehow get a new identity. Now I'm really thinking crazy, he thought. He wondered if a crazy person wonders if he's crazy. But even as he thought this, an even crazier idea kept popping into his head. He knew it was too crazy or even to consider. Still, if he was going to be a fugitive for the rest of his life, it would help to have some money, perhaps a treasure chest full of money. You're crazy, he told himself. Besides, just because he'd found a lipstick container with KB on it, that didn't mean there was a treasure buried there. It was crazy. It was all part of a crazy feeling of happiness, or maybe it was destiny. He reached over and shook Zero's arm. Hey, Zero, he whispered. Huh? Zero muttered. Zero, wake up. What? Zero raised his head. What is it? You want to dig one more hole? Stanley asked him. We weren't always homeless, Zero said. I remember a yellow room. Hey, how old were you when you, Stanley started to ask but couldn't find the right words, moved out? I don't know. I must have been real little because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrist and made my hands clap together. She used to sing a song to me, the one you sang, but it was different though. Zero spoke slowly, as if searching his brain for memories and clues. And then later I know we lived on the street, but I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house and not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon, and they were resting on the shadow of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but long enough so that they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave at the first hint of daylight so they'd have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole. Then they would hide by it until everyone went to sleep. I don't know if it's a good idea to go back there, but we'll see. They would dig for as long as it seemed safe, and not a second longer, and then, treasure or no treasure, they'd head up the dirt road. If it was absolutely safe, they'd try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero had said. Remember, Stanley had warned, the door to the rec room squeaks. Now he lay on his back, trying to save his strength for the long days ahead. He wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better to let him just talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own parents. In her last letter, his mom was worried that they might be evicted from their apartment because of the smell of the burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they'd been told he'd ran away from camp, or if they were told he was dead. An image appeared in his head of his parents hugging each other and crying. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings he'd had the night before, the inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny, but those feelings didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning they headed down the mountain. They dumped their caps in the water hole before putting them on their heads. Zero held the shovel and Stanley carried the sack, which they crammed with onions and 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of broken jar on the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing to a patch of weeds. Zero turned to look up toward the mountain. Wow, that's a long way. You were light, Stanley said. You'd already thrown everything up, and that was inside your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on a loose rock, slipped, and then fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack, and onions spilled around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed onto a thorny vine. The vine ripped out of the earth, but slowed him down a little bit, so he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled a thorn out of the palm of his hand. Yeah, he said. He was all right. He was worried more about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pants legs. The jars hadn't broken, and the onions had protected them, like styrofoam packing material. Glad you didn't do that while you were carrying me, Zero said. They lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was just rising above the lake. They walked directly toward it. Soon they stood at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see some remains of the Mary Lou off in the distance. You thirsty? Stanley asked. No, said Zero. How about you? No, Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink, although they didn't mention it. It was become kind of a challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot from where they had climbed up. They eased themselves down from one ledge to another and let themselves slide in other places, being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but headed in what he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. You thirsty? Zero asked. Nah, said Stanley. Because we do have 3 full jars of water, said Zero. I think maybe it was getting too heavy for us. If you drink some, it'll lighten your load. I'm not thirsty, said Stanley. But if you want a drink, I'll give you some. I'm not thirsty, said Zero. I'm just worried about you. Stanley smiled. I'm a camel, he said. They walked for what seemed like a very long time, and they never came across the Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were heading in the right direction. It seems like they should travel at night when it's not so hot, and plus no one can see them. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed toward the setting sun. Now they were heading toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west. More